Welcome back to this week's episode of Midweek Modern Craftsman, where it is a lovely 10 degrees outside. I'm happy to be sitting inside of my office recording this episode. And today we are going to dig into some topics that revolve around cost plus contracting. The reason that I am recording this is I recently had a consulting call with a guy who was struggling with some questions that clients were asking him when he was presenting his proposals in a cost plus format. And I think that most of it comes down to the way that he's allocating costs and where he's attributing them to in his contract. So we're going to dig into, overhead, project specific overhead, general conditions, and then market rates versus fully burdened rate, all of those good things. So if you're interested in cost plus contracts, stay tuned. So the first thing that we are going to dig into are general conditions. So what are some examples of general conditions? So these are going to be typically an above the line item, which at times, and this is what we dig into, could be management or supervision. Typically, I'm going to have that as a separate line item, but temporary facilities, whether it's fencing, dumpsters, toilets, site utilities, water, electricity, rental of equipment, job site specific communication, safety costs, permit fees, inspections, cleanup, waste removal, administrative support. So those are a few examples of general conditions. So there's a couple of ways that you can account for these, and it depends on the type of work that you're doing. But typically when I'm looking, or when you would be looking at budgeting for this, it's going to be based on a timeline, right? Where I'm going to say, hey, if this project is 12 months, these are the costs that we're going to incur for general conditions. But I want to be able to break that down to an itemized cost. So I'm budgeting for it, looking at bigger picture, whether it's weekly, monthly, how many dumpsters do we need typically for this size project, how many toilets, how much management we have, how many inspections. I'm going to budget looking at it from the overall big picture, but then I'm going to break that down because it's cost plus into an itemized cost. And for many reasons, but one just being transparency to the client. Also, if the project winds up going longer because the scope changed, because there was items that were added to the project, I'm not at risk for basically saying, hey, we have a monthly cost for general conditions and the project's going to take 12 months. So it ends up being more work, just like everything with cost plus. You're going to have to manage and track that as per your itemized cost. But to me, it builds trust in the relationship with your client. And also, just like everything with cost plus, it's fully transparent. So I'm not as heavily at risk doing it that way. One of the things that we dug into on this call, which the conversation came from a client, we're just asking, right, we understand the markup, we understand the numbers, but why is this number in general conditions look so much higher? And part of that is because at times people will put management within general conditions, and for a cost plus contract, I don't think that is the best way to do that. It makes your general conditions line item look super high. I do believe it should be above the line, so you should be making your markup on that, especially if you're self-performing management. But to me, that should be a direct cost that is attributable to that specific job. So it also should not be within your overhead or your plus of your cost plus, right? That plus may account for some of your business overhead and your management or administrative management on your business, right? That could be within that percentage. If that's a 12 to 20% markup, that will be on that. But for me, management and supervision on a project would be direct cost of that project. That should be above the line, and you should be having your plus percentage on top of that. When we think of overhead, typically we are thinking of fixed overhead cost, which basically means these expenses are going to remain relatively constant regardless of how much work you have going on or if you have any work going on, right? So for your business to be in business, even if you had no work going on, what would it cost to be in business? So that's going to be your office, your rent, your mortgage, salaries for staff within the office. If you have administrative people, estimators, accountants, your insurance. And yeah, that does fluctuate based on how much work you do. But typically, if you're in business, you're going to have general liabilities insurance, workers' comp, any sort of depreciation on your equipment, your vehicles, professional fees, right? You're going to have legal fees throughout the year. Business development, marketing, advertising, website, branding, all of that stuff. Those are going to be fixed fees that regardless of how much work you're doing or no work at all, you're going to maintain those fees. And the way that typically that's going into your overhead is basically based on a cost of goods sold or a revenue for the year where you're saying, hey, on average, or this past year, we did X amount of volume. So this was our overhead with regard to that amount of volume. And then you're going to figure out a percentage or a proportion of that that's you're able to put on every job based on the cost of goods sold for that job. So where you have to be careful, and I had this conversation with Nick recently, is when you're basing your overhead, your markup, your percentage based on an amount of revenue or cost of goods sold for the year, and then the next year you either do more work or less than that, especially when you do less than that, because you're now applying a percentage to projects that does not actually cover your overhead, right? So if you do $1 million one year and $500,000 the next year, and you're going off of an overhead percentage that's supposed to be applied to $1 million, and you're only doing $500,000 worth of work, you're actually not covering your overhead through your percentages. So you have to be really careful when you're looking at your overhead and project what you're looking to put in place each year. And if you realize, hey, we don't have enough work lined up, we're not quite doing the volume, you probably need to adjust your overhead markup to cover those costs, because you're amortizing them over the projected cost of goods sold or revenue for the year. And if that's any different than what prior years or historic years were like, you may not be covering the costs based on the amount of work you're putting in place. So when you are looking at a cost plus project, you essentially have an overhead and a profit markup that's getting applied to the direct project costs. So for most cost plus contracts, you're going to have separate site and project specific management costs that are above and beyond or separate from your business overhead costs. So those costs, which are specific to this project or specific to this site, are going to be above the line, right? So your overhead and your profit, your plus is going to be applied on top of them. So that was the conversation that I had with this guy. It's like, you do have overhead that may be within your general conditions, that may be overhead that fluctuates according to the project. You're also going to have overhead that's business overhead that is not directly tied to this project. That's just general overhead that's going to be in that plus figure that you're calculating for. But then you have management that is directly tied to this project. And whether that's a site super or a project manager, if you did not have this job, you would not have those costs. And Nick has explained this to me when you're trying to figure out what's an overhead versus job cost. And basically, if you were in business but you did not have this job, would you incur that cost? So even something like Buildertrend or a project management software, you would not be paying for that fee if you were not performing this job. So that should be a job cost, and that shouldn't go in an overhead cost. So typically those job costs are going to be above the line, meaning they're going to have the markup and your overhead applied on top of them. So that's going to be labor, materials, subcontractors, um, site specific project management, supervisor salary, those things. So you have to make sure that that is a line item that's above the line. So you're going to be covering the cost of them plus making your overhead or profit on that. That should not be within general conditions, and that should not be compensated for in your plus, which is typically that 12 to 20%. And then below the line is your overhead, your profit, your office, rent, utilities, accounting, company insurance, your markup, stuff like that. So the reason I feel that project management should be a direct job cost, again, because it's attributed to a specific project. You are managing that project, that project manager is working directly to that project. It provides transparency, right? You're going to budget for this number, again, based on historical data, based on the complexity of the project, the length, the duration of the project, how much time you're going to have in management, but then you're also going to have to manage that on the back end and track that on the back end, right? To make sure that you're spending the appropriate amount of time and not over investing, or changes to the scope are not creating more management costs for you. This is why we pulled this out of overhead and have it as a separate above the line item to protect us from that. So you're able to recover these costs on a project that winds up being more complex, and also that you're not overbilling for a project that's simpler or a project that's smaller. Again, so much of my model is, hey, I don't want to make more and I don't want to make less. I just want to be compensated for my time. And having this project specific above the line item for management ensures that I'm covering my costs as long as I'm managing that properly on the back end. And then my clients are not paying for more or less than the work that we are putting in place. So there are times when you may have project management be an overhead cost. And again, that's going to be general business operations. If it's company wide, if there's training, administrative tasks that can't necessarily be tied to one specific project, that would go in your overhead. Also, I know that there's guys who work on a bunch of small projects, and it becomes very convoluted to be able to tie their time to a specific project where they may be hitting 5-6 projects in a day. Some people work that out where they're going to apply that management across all of their jobs based on how many jobs they're historically doing. So it does happen with what I do and with what I know most people do with T&M, where you have a T&M contract because of the complexity of the job and the type of project that normally you're able to attribute time directly to that job and track it efficiently and effectively. All right, so let's dig into how you're charging for this, right? So typically, if it's I would look at management when it's above the line as a separate line item as any function of our self-performed labor, where we are essentially capturing the cost of that fully burdened rate, or we're going to make sure that our market rate is covering that fully burdened rate. So what's the fully burdened rate? Say that I'm paying somebody $25 an hour to work. That's their wage. And then I have to understand what the direct and indirect costs of having that employee are, right? So I have their direct wages, I have payroll taxes, benefits, workers' comp. If I have small tool and equipment allowances, any sort of training, if they have cell phone, if they have a vehicle, if they get paid overtime, whatever is going into that, I need to make sure that I'm covering that fully burdened rate. So this is going to be different for every company, but let's just say that I'm going to assume, hey, it's 2x. My burden rate, whatever I'm paying somebody, if it's between $30 and $50, it's 2x. So if I'm paying somebody a wage of $35 an hour, my burden rate would be 70. We do offer a labor burden calculator on the website, moderncraftsman.co. That's a free download. You can also find it on our Instagram. Um, if you want to actually calculate that, but let's just for conversation's sake say it's 2x, right? So my fully burdened rate for somebody I'm paying $25 an hour would be 50. So that would be the rate that's going into my contract. And then I'm charging, being that that's above the line, I'm going to be charging my markup and my overhead on top of that. So if it's 20%, right, I'm adding 20% to that $50 an hour. So what ends up happening a lot of times is that we don't necessarily know who's going to be working on that project. We don't necessarily know who's going to be working for us on a project that we're budgeting for 2 years down the road, right? Some of our best employees may not be with us. So what you are looking to budget typically is going to be a market rate. So what you have to do is you have to make sure that your fully burdened rate, whoever you're putting into that job, is covered with your market rate. So anytime that we're bidding projects or we're creating a budget, the goal is to create an apples to apples comparison, right? So based on who I have working for my company and based on who I plug and play into each project, the fully burdened rate may change. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to create a budget that meets an industry standard or that aligns with the market rate. So you're trying to create and determine fair pricing for your clients where they're not paying above market rate, and also, you're not cutting yourself short charging under market rate. I have some very exciting news for all of you. The Contractor Coalition Summit is hosting a meetup at IBS and KIBS. So that's going to be Monday, February 24th, 2025. I know we're already into 2025. It's crazy. 6 to 8 p.m. It's at the Nomad at Park MGM, Las Vegas. So this is not a summit. This is not a conference. Honestly, this is just going to be a bunch of people hanging out, open bar, food, and all the drinks that you can enjoy. And you'll have extra because I don't drink, so you can have my drinks. Early bird pricing is live. There will be no tickets at the door. So if you want to go to this, you have to buy them beforehand. I'm posting a link to it on this post. Hop on there now. You're not going to want to miss out on this. Again, no tickets at the door. February 24th, 6 to 8 p.m., Nomad, Las Vegas, which is at the Park MGM. I'll be there. Nick will be there. Brad will be there. Morgan will be there. And a lot of other people. So come check it out. Open bar, food, great hanging out. It's really going to be a lot of fun. I'm looking forward to seeing all of you there. And let me know if you have any questions. So using this market rate instead of your actual burden rate. Well, first off, again, like I mentioned before, it can be really difficult to project who's going to be working for you, what you'll be paying, managing it on the back end, who's spending what amount of hours on what project. So by using a market rate, you're trying to establish a budget that's reasonable that you can manage on the back end of the job, right? You're trying to allocate enough time, enough hours, whatever the efficiency rates are for that project to create a realistic budget, because a cost plus contract at the end of the day, it's about maintaining price. Yeah, it's about maintaining and upholding the budget. Yeah, it's about schedule and scope and everything else. But in actuality, the scope changes on every project. So a well-executed, well-managed cost-plus project is not necessarily one that closes out exactly what you had budgeted, but it's one that manages that scope and manages that budget appropriately, because the scope changes. Things happen, design changes. So properly communicating to a client when there are changes. Yes, you may be spending more money. No, this is unavoidable. Yes, we can borrow from somewhere else, or we can value engineer this to get us back closer to budget. So a well-managed cost plus job does not necessarily mean that you executed the work scope exactly as anticipated and the price exactly as anticipated, but you worked within the contract constraints and you set expectations that were realistic and you communicated to all partners within this project and all stakeholders within this project effectively, so that everyone understands what they're spending and what they're getting. So as you're creating this budget and establishing this budget, you're trying to create efficiencies and rates and labor quantities that are similar to others within the industry. You don't want to overcharge, you don't want to overcharge. So using a market rate instead of your actual burden rate in your contract can wind up being a little bit more fair, actually more transparent and more consistent across the entire job. So a burden rate is going to reflect your actual true costs, where a market rate is going to offer more of a competitive benchmark to make sure that all parties are aligned with the industry standards. So what people will say is, hey, right, you charge $125 market rate, but your fully burdened rate is less than that. That's an issue. When at the end of the day, this is the price that they agreed upon, and there's so many things to consider when you are figuring your burden rate. And again, from one employee to the next, it may change, and it changes with efficiencies. It changes with the structure of your business. So it winds up not being apples to apples, right? So at the end of the day, a market rate is going to align you with everyone else. And at times, clients may feel, hey, well, you're charging a market rate and you're actually paying for less, or you have hidden or cost loaded into that number that we're paying that you're actually making above and beyond what you anticipate. But what you're doing is actually protecting your company, protecting the client, from any numbers that may fluctuate from when you bid that job to when you're managing that job. Again, so you're looking to control the budget. Your burden cost, insurance may change. The efficiency from one employee to the next may change. So putting a fully or relying directly on a fully burdened rate may not be the most accurate price for budgeting for a project. So at the end of the day, your market rate, you need to ensure that your market rate is covering your most exposure on your burdened rate. So if you use somebody who's slightly less, maybe it gives you a little wiggle room in the budget, but you don't want to be paying somebody a higher burden rate than what you budgeted for as far as market rate. With Cost Plus, with all of our budgeting, what we're looking to do is try and create as accurate a budget as possible given the information that we need. And a lot of times, a market rate will provide that even playing field for everyone, so that if clients are basing or comparing your price to somebody else, that market rate is in line. It's not underinflated, it's not overinflated, and then you're putting enough money into the budget to manage it on the back end, to the appropriate level based on your company. So that from our perspective, as a builder's perspective, the market rates are going to allow for a slight buffer, right? In ensuring that the internal costs don't change or fluctuate and negatively affect our profitability. If I put in a fully burdened labor cost to the penny, and then I have to, something changes with that employee, right? Or my insurance goes up, and now I can't actually cover the cost of that employee. And every hour that every hour that employee works, they're actually costing me money. So typically, or not typically, but a lot of times you are putting a market rate on these projects while establishing the budget. And again, the goal for that is not necessarily, you're not looking to say, hey, I'm going to put a market rate of $150 and then I'm going to find the least expensive employee to work on this project so I can maximize what I'm making. That's not what you're doing. And you have to ensure that your clients don't understand that. What you're trying to do is create a realistic budget for this project to hire the most well-qualified employee or labor that fits that client's program and fits this market rate or industry standard. So again, you're not coming in well under a price point or well over the price point that your client's willing to pay. Another benefit to using market rates, if you're bidding a lot of projects, you do a lot of work where it's easier to price that work and say, hey, here's the market rate for um, a helper, for a lead carpenter, for a superintendent, and then finding the pieces, the puzzles to fit into that. That ends up being a lot easier to price jobs on a bigger scale, to price more work instead of saying, hey, this is my exact cost for this employee. They're going to be on this job. I'm not going to be able to pull them off and put them on another job. It just will make your head spin. So finding that market rate that you can fit your employees into, or you can make that number work for your projects and still execute the contract and meet the level of execution and align your client's expectations with that market rate is ideal. Again, these market rates really are just trying to create this objective benchmark for our business, but also our clients, because the actual burden rate is going to vary. It's going to vary from employee to employee. It's going to vary from company to company based on your company specific expenses, your overhead structure, and it winds up not being apples to apples, right? Your fully burdened labor rate may be completely different than another company who pays their employee the same exact wage. So by putting in market rates for these labor categories and values for these items within your budget, just creates this objective benchmark to say, hey, we're all on the same level playing field. You understand the level of execution. This is the rate that gets you there. This is the rate for our management to get you there. This is the rate for our in-house carpenters to get you there. And then it's your job on the back end to obviously manage scope, manage execution, manage expectations, and manage the amount of time that you're putting into this job to make sure that it aligns with the initial budget that was proposed. So obviously a bit of a deep dive into cost plus, and it's not something really that I anticipated doing, but being that this is fresh on my mind from having this consulting call and realizing that there's a lot of gray area there. The other thing that most people don't realize with cost plus is very similar to everything else. You want to make sure that legally you are the way that you are executing your cost plus contracts, you want to make sure that you are legally protecting yourself. You are not doing anything illegal, but there are different ways to do different things. There are different ways to create a markup from an optics perspective that aligns with your client's needs. People attribute different expenses within their company, right? If there's a company who manages a ton of small jobs, their supervision may be an overhead cost, and they could be bidding that project against somebody who only does a handful of projects, and their supervision is a direct project cost. So although the goal is to usually compare apples to apples, it's not always possible. So you have to figure out, while you are constructing your contracts, if you are operating cost plus, if you're operating T&M, if you're operating fixed cost lump sum, whatever it may be, you have to make sure that legally and contractually you're playing by the rules. But also you have to figure out what works for you from an optics perspective, how you make money, right? If you're paying for management, if you are self-performing and you make more money self-performing, that may allow you to pull some of that overhead out of or some of that management out of your overhead and put it on a job cost, which then you're charging on top of. So it's different for every company. It's different for every area of this country. So you have to find out what works for you. How do you make money? What do your numbers look like? Where do your costs go? How are you allocating them within your budget, above the line, below the line? How are you allocating supervision? Is it a direct cost to a project? Is it, within your general conditions? Is it within your overhead? You have to figure all of that out and make sure that your numbers work the way that you're doing it. It's not a one size fits all. Everything that I spoke about today is not a blanket statement. This is how I would approach it, how I would address it, and what I do. But you have to make sure for your company, for your jurisdiction, that you are legally doing what's required of you, and that you're setting yourself up for success. So, a bit diving into the specifics here on this podcast, a rather technical podcast. But I thought just really good information and food for thought. So I hope that you all enjoyed this today, and I will catch you. Well, actually, before I hop off, by the time this comes out, our version 2.0 of our pre-construction course will have launched. We put out version 1.0 a few months ago. And after putting that out, after getting our feet wet, after getting some feedback, we realized that this is just such an important aspect of business, and so many people need help with this. And this is critical for not only differentiation and getting yourself set up for success, but also managing the project on the back end, like developing this whole budget, contract negotiation, obviously bidding a project. It's really, really important and critical for success. So we realized that we wanted to go back in and we wanted to update this course. We wanted to add more content to it. We wanted to change some things around and then re-release this course. Let me think, by the time this comes out, there might be only a few days left to purchase this course. After a bunch of back and forth, Nick and I realized that it makes the most amount of sense for us to only offer enrollment to this course a couple of times a year. So there's a 10-day window that this course is open to be enrolled. You will maintain lifetime access to it. You will maintain any access to any revisions, addendums, but it takes a lot of work to keep this course up and running. Nick and I have our hands full with everything that we have going on, and the main priority is to create a really valuable experience for you where we can help you if need be. We can continue to develop the coursework, and by limiting the enrollment, to us, that's going to create the best experience and the most value for our students. So we will close the doors on enrollment. I believe it's as the clock hits midnight, turning over to February 4th. So as you know, as we roll over to February 4th, this course will no longer be available until we determine the next time we'll be doing another revision and relaunching the course. But you have 10 days, which at this point you have less than 10 days to enroll in this course. And we're not 100% positive as to when we'll offer it again or when we'll reopen the doors. But again, we're looking to ensure that we can devote as much time as we need to the people who have already enrolled in the course, invest in the course, who need help, and to continue to develop their processes. So if you're interested, you're going to have to act now because the door is closing February 4th. All right, that's it for me. I'll catch you guys next week.